I've got a great interview for you today, and I look forward to sharing this conversation that I had with Julie Derr. Now, Julie is a coach for women in the midlife time period, and she is a deep expert in the space of physical training, nutrition, wellness overall, lifestyle, and also hormones. And so to keep this relatively brief today, I really focused on the training side. We talk about weight training, resistance training, a little bit of cardio, and a little bit of impact. And then we really get into talking about hormones, and we talk about some really interesting kind of novel ways of doing hormone therapy that I currently am investigating and considering implementing in our practice. So stick around for this conversation if you're interested in weight training, impact, and hormone therapy. All right, Julie. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really look forward to bringing all of your rich content into our audience and getting them some information specifically about the physical training side that you're doing with your clients. And I really look forward to talking about hormones a little bit with you too, because I know you talk a lot about that. But before we get into all of that, will you just give me a little bit of your background? How did you get into this space? What exactly are you doing with your clients?
Yeah, so my background goes way back. So, even as a young child, I was introduced to kind of the concept of hormones, not really overall health, but hormones, because my dad and my sister were both diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was young, probably like 5. So I kind of grew up in a household focused on health, and then actually always thought I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. I didn't tell you that. Went to college thinking I was going to do that, and then ended up becoming a physical therapist. So I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer by education. And then really I just transitioned over the last 5 years into health coaching. I can do that virtually. So I work primarily with midlife women and really kind of a comprehensive approach with diet, exercise, all the modalities of health, and then kind of have thrown in kind of hormone education and things like that in just more recent years.
Yeah, that's great. And all of those areas we could talk about for a really long time. But what I really like to focus on, and I think we don't talk about enough on our channel and in our community, is different aspects of the training side. Because we have, I think, a lot of people in our community who have osteoporosis, but then also a lot of people who are concerned about bone health, or maybe they're in perimenopause, postmenopause, and they don't know much about their bone health. So can you give us a sense of how you're handling the population of women that are in that group and how you get them going on a training program, especially if they really haven't been doing a lot in the, say, previous 30 years?
Yeah, which is a lot of my clients. They either have clients that come to me not doing anything, or some of them have just been confused trying everything. And I will say a lot of my clients probably have some underlying bone health issues, but most of them don't know it because they haven't been tested. So I am seeing that population that is in perimenopause or menopause, but haven't necessarily been diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia. So I do kind of a comprehensive program. I include, kind of like the 5 foundations of exercise. Cardiovascular exercise, which is not really going to help you with your bone health, right? Mm-hmm. But it's going to help with the other things that you're going to be dealing with, especially if you're in perimenopause or menopause. Strength training, which I know you talk about a lot. That's huge for bone health. And, I meet clients where they're at. If they have not done anything, we start very, very basic in terms of like just body weight exercises and some really simple things. So cardiovascular, strength training, mobility, flexibility is definitely important. Some kind of impact exercises, and not everyone can do those. And I know you talk about that as well. Not everyone should do those or could do those or not start doing those, but can build up to those. And then also some rest days and incorporating some just regular restful activities, because I think a lot of women think more is better. So they go out and just go crazy and don't take a break, which can also be impactful for hormones, for adrenals, for just overall health. So kind of those are the foundational things. And then, if people come to me and they're starting from ground zero, I really just get them on a basic walking and kind of body weight exercise program and then progress from there.
Yeah, that's I love that. I love the 5 principles you laid out there. What about, can you dig into a little bit more from the cardiovascular side or cardio side? So my experience is, and actually I love posting on this whenever I travel and I go to hotel gyms, it's so clear that like the women are on the treadmill and the stair stepper and the men are over in the weight room, and it kind of like drives me nuts because I talk so much about the importance of resistance. So when you say cardio, what what kind of cardio, what level of cardio, and then what kind of exercises do you think are most beneficial for people in that space?
Yeah, and as a self-proclaimed cardio junkie, so I've run 5 marathons. I'm an avid runner. I love to run, but I've recognized over the years that's not going to cut it. And yes, you're right. Most women, if they have the option, will choose just cardio. So really, varying the intensity of cardio, not just getting on the treadmill or Stairmaster or whatever your kind of exercise modality is, and going at the same level. I really am a big proponent of changing the zones. So, zone 2, a lower intensity exercise, maybe as a warm up or a cool down, and then really implementing some higher intensity once in a while. And that doesn't have to be high impact, but a lot of people kind of correlate that with high impact. But high intensity, where you're getting like over 85% of your VO2 max or max heart rate, just a couple times, maybe a week, 1 or 2. But again, that's not a place to start. I think women are afraid of that as well, at that equally as they are afraid of strength training. So, but I do think it's important. I know there are a lot of influencers out there saying all you have to do is strength train. That's it. And that's great for bone health and, some other kind of health markers, but it's not necessarily always great just for cardiovascular fitness.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'm guilty of pushing people in that direction for sure. Because when I start with them, generally they're not doing anything, right? Or they have a background like yours, and all they're doing is cardio. So I'll sort of be like, just stop and let's start lifting some weights, because my patients have sarcopenia and osteoporosis, right? They don't have muscle mass. They need to work on these things. And I want them to add that back. And so I come from a kind of an anti-aging longevity background. And so I do end up adding those things in later, but focusing on the resistance training is so important for us. But I love the way you just said that, like zone 2 is sort of a base, and then you're really pushing high intensity as the alternative to that. But what I find is the error in my eyes is that most women will kind of aim for that like zone 3, 4 and sit there for an hour and a half, which is inflammatory, provokes joint problems, and it doesn't help with fat loss. And so I just just drives me nuts to watch people just sweating away on the Stairmaster, not at high or low intensity.
Right. It's that moderate intensity that really gets you. And that's I think where most people kind of end up. And I did see one of your recent stories, and you were doing your high intensity. And I think most people don't have any idea what that feels like to be really exercising at that intensity, or just don't understand the different zones and how they should feel at those different zones.
Yeah. And it's funny too. I love my audience, because it's the audience that I didn't really anticipate working with when I started this company, but I love this audience because they're so inquisitive. And I had multiple people ask me, what's that black thing around your chest? Right? Like not knowing that a heart rate monitor is something that is really helpful in that situation to monitor, like, what is your actual intensity? And it just goes to show how novice this group can be from an exercise perspective. And that's one of the reasons why they got here.
Yeah. And I'm also a big fan of just, zone 2 outside. I think so. It just helps you really get in that parasympathetic state and, work on adrenal function. And a lot of women are struggling with that too. Their cortisol's off. So really like morning walks, or just kind of getting those walks in when you can. And also, this population usually has some insulin sensitivity issues as well. So, incorporating all those things is going to be important for not only bone health, but just metabolic health.
Yeah. And so after I did that high intensity workout, I put on my rucksack and I went out and walked around the neighborhood for about 30 minutes. So I was a great day, but that is not every day by any means. So I need to do more of that for sure. I'd love to double click a little bit on the impact stuff. So I struggled with this early on as we were launching a telehealth program, and I really struggled with what to recommend for people from a training perspective, because I was afraid to make recommendations over a telehealth platform. I can't see their form. We don't have the right approach to watch people work out. So I was afraid to tell them to do heavy lifting, but let's talk about impact, because that's where I was really afraid to tell people to do impact. Now we've changed that. And so we do have an impact program, but I'm curious, how you've approached this, knowing that some of your patients likely do have some bone health issues. How do you approach impact, and what are the things you're having them do?
Yeah. So impact starts slow. I definitely don't start with impact, but I also have a coaching program, and I used to way back do actually videos for clients. I don't have time to do that anymore, but it doesn't have to be a lot, especially to begin with. Just general like jump squats, lunge jumps, jumping in place. I call them pencil jumps, jump rope. So just general things like that involve jumping. Also, for the higher level clients that probably don't have osteoporosis, but again, a lot of my clients, again, don't know if they have osteoporosis or osteopenia, box jumps or just jumping off some kind of, smaller steps and things like that. So those are kind of the things people can do at home without any equipment. You don't need any equipment, but you're right. Without monitoring them, it is kind of hard, especially in your population that really already has that diagnosis. But I do find that is helpful for clients, and plus they can kind of incorporate some of the higher intensity with that. So it's kind of like killing two birds with one stone.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I see of my patients and people in our healthspan nation that are, they're following me on Instagram and they're increasing their, what they're putting out there on their own account, which is super fun. So then you watch them like getting into some of these things. And every now and then I'll catch them on a video that they're posting and I'm like, let's fix that. But it's good feedback, so I can actually see what they're doing, which is fun. The other thing I wanted to dig into with training before we move over to hormones is heavy resistance training versus the traditional like 5-pound dumbbells that I see so many people starting with. What are your thoughts on getting women in this, this 45, 55, 60 age group into heavier resistance training? Do you support that one? And then how do you get them there?
Yeah, I absolutely support it. And I think the dialogue in the last, year has been heavy training. So I find that most women already come to me knowing a little bit about that. There's a rare person that's not doing anything that doesn't know anything about it, but absolutely support heavy lifting. And, as someone that's been in this space for 30 years, I've seen the whole gamut, right? The whole 10 years ago, it was all about Pilates, and it still is. And there's a place for that, but definitely to impact, muscle remodeling, especially as hormones are changing, you have to lift heavier. And the women, I had a client just the other day who's a Pilates instructor, and she said, I'm a Pilates instructor, but I don't really do Pilates. I do heavy lifting. So I think women, they recognize that Pilates or, some kind of smaller, less intense weight training is going to be impactful for toning, but it's not really going to be very impactful for building muscle or impacting bone.
Yeah, that's great. It reminded me of a patient I saw yesterday. This is a woman who's worked with us for a couple of years, and she's almost 70. And she's like kind of really mopey about her progress because she feels like she should be doing better than she is. But she just told me, she was like, over the last 2 years, I've put on 4 pounds of muscle. And I was like, what? You're almost 70 years old and you changed your body composition by that much. I mean, I think that's really remarkable. And it goes to show that it's never too late, right?
Yeah, I agree. And last year I did the DEXA and a bone and in body, and I put on 3 pounds of muscle. And I remember I posted that on my story. And first of all, people are afraid of putting on, right? I think that women are starting to slowly embrace the strong over skinny, but in general, a lot of women don't want to see the scale change. Yeah. But yeah, having that as a goal, increasing muscle, and you obviously have to have a scale that's going to give you those biometrics too. But that's remarkable for a 70-year-old. Wow.
Yeah, I was super proud of her because she's been so hesitant to do anything. She's so fearful about everything, but she is, over the course of the last year and a half, with a lot of coaching and a lot of time with our exercise physiologist and talking about form, she's actually doing some heavier stuff, and she's doing it. And her biomarkers show it. I'm really excited to see her next DEXA scan because I think she's going to actually see some improvement, which will be great for her. So then I'm glad you mentioned that about weight. So this is an area where this is, I think, global for women, and just part of our culture is just the skinny and worrying about gaining weight, not lifting heavy weights because worried about getting the quote unquote too big. And I love to challenge women. I've said this every time when a woman says this to me, I'm just worried about getting too big. I was like, man, prove me wrong. Please prove me wrong. Show me that you're going to get too big. And it hasn't happened yet. But gaining weight, I think, is interesting because when we start, and we're going to switch into hormones, but when I start, especially postmenopausal women who have been off of hormones or have never started hormones for 5 years or 10 years, then you get into this like gray area, risk area, like 15 years, 20 years. When they start estrogen, almost universally, they gain weight and it freaks them out. However, the benefit, in my opinion, outweighs the risk, and it's not fat weight, right? So let's start into hormones, because this is sort of, I think, an interesting space where you have found yourself and you're now educating people about hormone health. So how did you get into that, and why, if there's, OBGYNs and there's endocrinologists and there's all these different people that are talking about hormones, why is it even necessary for you to get into this space?
Yeah. So first of all, as a 55-year-old postmenopausal woman, I was thrown into this space, right? Because I'm menopausal. And I think a lot of women and even a lot of physicians, in their 30s, early 40s, you kind of have that mentality that if you exercise and eat right and do all the things, menopause is not really going to happen, or, you're not going to know it happened. And I will say, like, my hormonal journey was kind of rough. So I had 4 kids and 5 pregnancies in 5 years. So that kind of started my whole, like, my hormones were doing this for a long time in my 30s. And then, as I transitioned to my 40s, I didn't recognize at the time, but I was dealing with a lot of hormonal changes that I didn't recognize as hormonal changes, the hot flashes and night sweats. Obviously, other things are happening too that I didn't really recognize again until I was in my 50s, maybe the cardiovascular changes or some changes in my cholesterol. But as someone who was, really in tune to my body and asking questions from my providers, initially I was told absolutely no hormones, just, basically tough this out, you're fine. So I took that as gold. I thought that's what happens. And I, of course, like a lot of other women, had heard horror stories. I heard about the Women's Hormone, not the Women's Hormone Network, but the Women's Health Initiative. And I was afraid. So I didn't really pursue any kind of hormone replacement. And then when I did, I really was just kind of doing low level hormones. And it really wasn't, when I was kind of doing some deeper dives and understanding the physiology of what actually was happening. And then I don't think we discussed this, but I had my first bone scan. It was osteopenia. And that was kind of like, wait a minute, I'm doing some hormones. What's happening? And obviously I don't have any kind of recollection or any kind of impact about what was happening earlier before I did that test. But so that really kind of propelled me to do a lot of advanced training and get some more education in hormones. And now that's, I think one of the primary things that women come to me for, because they're so confused. There's so much misinformation, and they hear one thing from one person and one thing from another person. And a lot of these are physicians. I'm not a doctor, but I try to give them a well-rounded education about what's happening when hormones are declining, options for replacing them, and then all the other lifestyle things that you have to dial in. It's not just like hormone replacement's a magic pill.
Yeah, that's a great point too. And I love that, the coaching side of it. And in our program, we are coaching driven. So we are doing HRT, but we are not doing it for everyone, because we have an older population too. And so we really have to face the potential risk of people that are 20, 30 years out face to face, unfortunately. So not everybody can do it, but there are so many things you can do in addition to HRT. But understanding that HRT is a really powerful tool for people that are candidates, and probably more people are candidates. And this is a PSA. So if you don't think you're a candidate for HRT and you're a postmenopausal woman, listen up, because so many women are told that they're not good candidates for HRT, but they're being told the wrong risks. And it's always a benefit risk ratio. And if you don't understand the risks as a doctor and you don't understand the benefits, then you can't have that conversation. And that's really frustrating for me when people are told that the risks are too high when they don't even have any contraindications at all. And the benefits are so obvious, even if you're looking at the traditional benefits, but not to mention the ones that most doctors don't know about. So it's an aggravating conversation. And I really got exposed to this on our YouTube channel, where people would leave comments and they would tell their stories. And, hundreds, if not thousands of women telling me their stories about this is their situation, these are their symptoms, and this is what their doctor said. And to the point where we're, like, me as a team, as a leader of providers, we just look at it and say, well, we got to fix this. So I'm glad that more people are educating women, because there's so much, like you said, misinformation, and that word's gotten kind of wonky lately, but it's true. It's just misinformation. I also like the terms medical gaslighting. When doctors say that to patients and say, look, you don't need to worry about hormones. You're not that symptomatic. Your hot flashes aren't that bad. Don't worry about it. they're missing the big picture because it's not necessarily just about that, right? Like those can be very bad, but the bigger picture is what about the vascular changes, the heart changes, the brain changes, the muscle mass loss, the bone health, like all of it, you know? So yeah, it's definitely a big space for me. So then what do you think are the biggest impact that you see? Because you're seeing women on the training side, on the nutrition side, lifestyle side, but what are the biggest impacts you see as women go through this without optimized hormones or improper hormone replacement is another way to look at it. You know, what are you seeing happen to them that they're not necessarily seeing themselves?
Yeah, and I do a lot of education on this. So people automatically think it's just, like I said, the hot flashes, the night sweats, the weight gain, right? And that's a lot of times what people come to me initially for because they're having those symptoms. And then it's when I explain to them the cardiovascular changes, the like orthopedic issues. So you and I discussed this a little bit. So, you know, a lot of inflammatory things, rotator cuff tendonitis, or a lot of the tendinitises, frozen shoulder, plantar fasciitis, all of those things that, yes, maybe a little related to diet, lifestyle, but when estrogen leaves the house, when your ovaries are no longer working and inflammation increases, I see so many women with orthopedic issues. And then it's just explaining to them the potential changes in their bone health and their brain health and their cardiovascular markers. So people message me all the time, my cholesterol is high. Like all of a sudden my cholesterol is high, or, you know, I have a frozen shoulder. So those things they don't put together with menopause and changes in hormones. And that's really why I decided to really kind of change my hormone replacement program because, I was already feeling good. I was, you know, not really having a lot of those outward symptoms. It was the other physiological things that I knew were happening to me that I wanted to mitigate. So it's a lot of education, you know, just kind of letting women know that, okay, just because you have a hot flash, this is, you know, not the end all be all. There are a lot of other things that are happening.
Yeah. And I think honestly, it's the women that don't have vasomotor symptoms, the women that don't have hot flashes and night sweats. They're like, meh, I stopped cycling, yippee, right? And then there's no further conversation. And most doctors, if you as a woman go in and say, "Well, my cycle stopped, but I'm doing fine," that's the end of the conversation, which is a big tragedy. Because now I'm seeing those women, you know, 10 years, 15 years later, and they have osteoporosis. They weren't screened then. We don't know where they started, but they've got terrible T scores now. And so much of that could have been prevented probably if they were to have that conversation. So with all the research that you've done and what you're telling your clients now, because there's so many different ways to do HRT. So walk me through what you end up recommending for your clients. And so we'll start there. And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, and I educate them on all the different forms because there are so many different options for women. And I find, especially where I am, and I have a virtual practice, so where I am is different than where other clients are. But in Nashville specifically, women are offered pellets wherever you go. So that's one form. And, I educate them on transdermal. So, patches and creams, bioidentical creams. Patches can be, also FDA approved and also, prescribed by a regular practitioner without being compounded. Also, pellets, oral estrogens, oral progesterones, the difference between a progesterone and a progestin, which women, that lingo is really confusing for women. So I give them kind of a whole well-rounded education about options. And then really for most of my clients, I recommend a compounded kind of estradiol cream and then usually oral progesterone. Those are kind of my go-to, like for safety and what studies have shown. However, a lot of women already have come to me with saying, "Oh, I have pellets. Is that okay?" And obviously, if you have a pellet, you can't remove the pellet, right? So I just give them education, and I really kind of steer them away from the pellets, from synthetic hormones. So again, a lot of women come to me too, and they're on the birth control pill, and they think that's hormone replacement. So it's just a lot of education, but in general, I really, usually recommend transdermal creams and oral progesterone.
Yeah, and that's totally in line with how we do it, and a little bit different than how I was trained. That's evolved for me, but I like to use the estradiol instead of Biest, and this is an area where there's quite a bit of controversy in the space that we're in. But getting away from using estriol because there's not great evidence on it, and it's not a strong estrogen. So let's use the thing that we are actually wanting to have value from. So let's use estradiol. And then oral progesterone, I mean, just hands down. And this is, again, public service announcement, like raise the red flag. Like if you're on a product that doesn't say micronized progesterone, then you're on a progestin, right? It just is. There are so many different versions. You can't even mention them all. But micronized progesterone is micronized progesterone, and anything else is the other thing. So micronized progesterone can be commercial. It can be prescribed by an OBGYN or other doctor. It can also be compounded in different avenues. But it's a capsule and it's taken at night, and it's amazing because it counters your estrogen. There's progesterone receptors all throughout the body, and it's really great for sleep because it metabolizes into a GABA receptor provoking compound. So women, if they haven't been on it, man, they just usually love it. So it's a really nice compound. Then let's dig into testosterone, because testosterone is an area where in the book that I'm writing, I ended up doing like half of it on testosterone, just because I feel like it is such an under discussed area. So where have you found testosterone to be helpful for, I would say, for some women, but then also where not? And this is where like pellets become a challenge, because pellet doctors tend to just use testosterone pellets for everybody. So where do you think testosterone's not the panacea for some women?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a place for testosterone. I think a lot of women, if they're being tested in their 40s or 50s, have low testosterone. I do think that in the training that I've had, women need to first dial in their estrogen and progesterone before they hop on board the testosterone train. But I think oftentimes that's not what happens. They go somewhere and they get a pellet, which maybe has a little bit of estradiol, a lot of testosterone, and they might feel good for a little while because they have more energy, their sex drive is better, they're happier. But the reality is they haven't really dialed in the major sex hormones, which are estradiol and progesterone, that are their cycling hormones that they had prior to menopause. So I definitely think there's a place for testosterone. Much more of a fan again of transdermal testosterone, and I've seen honestly horror stories from high levels of testosterone with pellets. So, and again, women don't really know the pros and cons prior to getting those. They're not being educated about, what the potential downsides are.
Yeah. So what are the horror stories that you've seen? Because I think it's really important to get this out. Because like you said, when a pellet goes in, you can't get it out. You can't like dig underneath your skin and try to find that thing. You're not going to find it. And so I've seen women on this ride too, but give me your experience. And what have you seen happen to women who have been on testosterone pellet doses that were not compatible with their physiology?
Yeah. So I've seen a lot of hair loss, a lot of increased facial hair, a lot of the androgenic symptoms. Some, a few women with a deeper voice, which they maybe didn't even really recognize. And then I also see that not only they're having those symptoms, but they're also having the symptoms of low estrogen because they're not getting the estradiol that they need. So, and there is, I think, some research to show that even the high levels of testosterone can even actually block some of the impact of estradiol at the receptor at the cellular level.
Yeah, I think there's evidence to support that both ways. That when you add estradiol, if you as a woman have adequate testosterone, it'll lower your testosterone because estrogen is the feedback loop in the brain for testosterone. But yeah, it can go the other way too. And I had a great case example of this week too, where I had a woman who was on pretty high dose for me of topical testosterone or transdermal. She was on 10 milligrams per ml, 2 clicks. So that would be 5 milligrams per day, which is higher than I usually do it. But we kind of worked, we stair stepped her up. Her testosterone levels in blood looked good. She felt good. And I see a fair number of doctors who are using testosterone only to try to avoid the quote unquote risk of estradiol and assuming that it's going to aromatize into estrogen, but her estrogen levels were still essentially zero. Right. And so it's just a great example where like she's not getting estrogen. Now she's in her 70s and it wasn't a candidate for estrogen. So, we're doing what we can do. But if you're on just testosterone and you're thinking you're getting adequate estrogen, it's very, very unlikely. Mm-hmm. For sure. All right. So then before we started recording, you and I were chatting about kind of a newish topic to me. It's kind of a controversial topic and something that you've really committed to yourself. Are you open to talking about your experience with how you're actually doing your hormones now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us what you're doing, and when people's heads explode, follow that with why you're doing it and all the potential benefits.
Sure. And to backtrack a little bit, so like I said, in my late 40s, I started, asking the questions about hormone replacement. And probably the first 2 or 3 years of menopause, I was doing nothing. And, really was not having really bad negative effects in terms of symptoms, but I just knew that there's something isn't quite right. So then I actually switched to biased, and I had experience like you said, like estradiol, estriol, my levels weren't even going up. And then really when I started understanding all these genomic effects of what estradiol and the peaks and the declines of estradiol in relation to progesterone, and I did some advanced training, really understanding the physiology behind that, I started just in the last year doing what's called physiologic dosing. So I am dosing my estradiol in levels that go to a peak. So I change my estradiol levels daily so that I get that day 12 peak like you would in a premenopausal woman, and then it declines, and then I add in the progesterone just half of my cycle. So I'm only taking progesterone half of the month. And again, I cycle that up and down too, just like a normal physiologically, menstruating female would. And then I do get a bleed. So every month I get a bleed. I'm not fertile. Like that's one of the first questions clients have when they talk to me. Like, wait, can you get pregnant? No, ovaries don't work anymore. So I'm not fertile, but I get that bleed. And that bleed is not only a representation of, shedding that uterine lining, but also the other genomic things that are happening at the cellular level in every system in my body. So I know it's not for everyone, but I do educate clients on this as an option. And it's a nuanced option, and not a lot of practitioners know about it or are comfortable with it. And I would say, I've had discussions with OBGYNs about it, and they're open, but a lot of them just don't have the training to be able to really supervise and manage it because they don't have the great understanding. But I'm with a doctor who really is really well versed. So he knows a lot about it and has been doing it for years. So I'm not the only one. There are many women that have been doing this for decades. You probably just don't hear about it.
Yeah, and so I was introduced to this relatively recently by a common colleague that we have between us, and it was, I've heard about it, I've read about it, I've looked into it, but similar to probably a lot of doctors where I'm like, I don't even know how I would work that into our practice, and what's the compelling reason to do so. But I've been exposed to literature recently, which is very compelling. We have always used what I would consider, I used to call it physiologic, but it's really not. But what I would say, more physiologic dosing, specifically for estradiol, because I wanted to saturate the receptors in the bone. So we would be aiming for higher serum levels than certainly you would get through a low dose estradiol patch, but not as high as you would see in a premenopausal woman. So these are two different things. So I was already marching down the pathway, but now I'm really convinced that this is something that I want to explore more. And probably start engaging in our practice. So I'm excited to hear that you're doing it and it's going well for you. What was that decision like for you? If you could just give me a sense of when you were informed about it and you started thinking like, oh wait, I'm going to actually start cycling again. I'm going to actually like bleed monthly again. Like what was that like for you to consider that as an option?
It was the easiest decision, honestly. Really, because I wanted to impact my longevity. I wanted to impact my bone health, my brain health, my neurological health. And honestly, I didn't even think twice about it. Like the whole cycling thing. Yes, you and I talked earlier about that's kind of the one of the only benefits of being in menopause. You don't have a cycle anymore. But it really was a no-brainer when I started thinking about how it's impacting my physiology by doing that. So, and also knowing, I think had I gone from just, premenopausal to not trying anything straight to this, maybe I would have had some more questions, but I had tried those other things, right? I tried the nothing approach. I also tried biased and, really, really low dose estradiol. And I didn't feel like those were having the impact that I wanted.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and I look forward to hearing more stories because I'm sure this video and others that we're going to put out specifically on this topic will provoke a lot of stories, especially on YouTube, because people are so generous, really, with telling us their stories on the YouTube comments. So I look forward to hearing that, because I think we're going to see that there's a lot of, like you said, women that are doing this that are afraid to talk about it. I think there's probably a lot of doctors that are doing it that are afraid to talk about it too, right? They're afraid of the criticism. So I look forward to kind of hearing that conversation and digging into it, and starting to talk about this within our own practice. I think that'll be a lot of fun. So I think we've been talking for over 30 minutes. So I think we should wrap this up. So any final thoughts you have for women who are listening? Definitely tell us how we can hear more about you and your story and the things that you're putting out on for content. So tell us more about that, but then also any other final thoughts about women that you could leave them with after listening to this.
Yeah, final thoughts are, first of all, if you're in this demographic where you have osteoporosis or osteopenia or just a midlife woman, you have hopefully at least a third to half of your life to live, right? So you want to optimize your health, and you're in charge of your own health. So there are so many things you can do. You do not have to live, feeling terrible, having these diagnoses that are just happening to you. You have some control. So really partnering with someone that can help you, optimize all nutrition, exercise, lifestyle, supplementation, hormones, whatever it might be in terms of supplements. And then, partner with that person and make a plan. I think that's where people get so confused. They don't know what to do, so they don't take the first step. But there are a lot of people out there that can help you. So that's, kind of final thoughts. And then you can find me on Instagram. I do a lot of, usually do a daily post on Instagram, probably kind of confusing because I go from exercise to hormones to nutrition. I kind of, touch on it all, but there. And then I also have a website, juliederwellness.com. You can find me there, book a call. And I do have coaching programs that I do, both group and individual coaching.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Julie, for your time. And I really appreciate your honesty and willingness to share your own story. I think the more people we can get into that situation where you're exposing yourself and being vulnerable is really helpful for women that are struggling. Like you said, they just get confusion. There's too much information. It's too conflicting. They just shut down and do nothing. And that's the worst thing you could do. So thank you for being open and honest. I really appreciate it. And you will definitely find us interacting on Instagram. So after you watch this, come and join us on the back and forth about hormones and nutrition and all the fun things that we talk about. All right, thanks for listening to this interview with Julie. Again, if you are interested in learning more about what she's doing on her side, take a look at her Instagram, and her website is great as well. Additionally, if you're having issues putting together your own bone health program, consider our free masterclass, link in the description on YouTube, or you can go to optimalhumanhealth.com and you can find a link for that there as well. See you in the next episode.